Deception, disguise, illusion. All tools utilized by the CIA as they fight a war that takes place in the shadows. Officers, agents, spies. Active pawns in a global game of high-stakes poker. Rescue missions, clandestine escapes, classified operations, resulting in new chances at life, and sometimes death.
These are the stories how we used deception and disguise and illusion and stealth and cunning and working in the shadows to get our hand on the lever that allowed us to alter the course of world events. And so we should share these. It's time.
Witness the world of international lies and deadly espionage as told by the CIA's own master of deception. For more than 25 years, Tony Mendez was chief of disguise within the CIA's prized Directorate of Science and Technology. Tony Mendez became the master of disguise, and with other CIA officers, he devised elaborate schemes of deception and illusion that gave the United States the critical advantage to win the Cold War. Until now, his stories have remained classified, his operations shrouded in secrecy. The deception techniques he developed are still used today. To deceive means to mislead by deliberate misrepresentation. It's about how you tell a lie, and in the context of international politics, of why you tell a lie. In the strategic sense, deception is about getting a tactical advantage against an enemy.
The idea of deception is to keep your troops off the battlefield. You want to have defeated the enemy before you ever enter the battlefield, so that there's an assured victory. So that's the reason for the lie. And there are many different ways to cast the lie.
A fascinating and famous example occurred during World War II. It was known as Operation Mincemeat. Historian Keith Melton.
During World War II, the British were certainly undermanned. They were outnumbered. They were, in 1940 and 41, virtually surrounded to the east by the German armies, and they recognized that they had to go beyond their limited capabilities to fight the war.
British intelligence devised a plan to deceive the Germans by taking a corpse and creating a man who never was.
They disguised him by putting him in the uniform of a Royal Marine major, and they named him Major Martin. They created an elaborate background. They put in his pockets receipts from a play, a note from his girlfriend, everything to make him believable. They took a submarine down into the Mediterranean, and they floated the body when they knew the tide was right, so that the body would come ashore in a desolate part of Spain that was known to be very pro-German. And attached to Major Martin's wrist was a handcuff attached to a briefcase. And in that briefcase were letters that were actual originals, but were created just for this deception operation. And in those letters, the Germans, if they carefully analyzed them, could draw the story that the invasion plans that were soon to happen would not be where we ended up going. They would be somewhere else.
They actually went to the dry cleaners where his clothes were cleaned to see if, in fact, this person had their clothes cleaned there. And they went to the place where he bought his shirts to see if, yes, indeed, he had bought his shirts there. It was an amazing deception operation, the detail that they had laid in, so that if a detailed investigation took place, that they would determine this was really a person, and it was true. So they were convinced, and so they bought the deception. they were waiting for us in the wrong place when we invaded.
The Germans were led to believe that Allied forces were landing north of the actual invasion site of Sicily. They moved their forces, weakening their defense and assuring an Allied victory in Italy. A successful deception that laid the groundwork for the Normandy invasion a year later. Disguise and deception. From the mythical Trojan horse to present-day espionage, these ancient arts have been a tool of warfare since biblical times. In the early part of the 20th century, even the most clever disguise techniques were lifted from the stages of vaudeville and early film, until the era of the Cold War. To escape surveillance and operate effectively, the CIA realized disguise had to be more than makeup and a change of clothing. The CIA relied heavily on its key branch, the Office of Technical Service, or OTS. They provided everything from alias documentation to the very elaborate disguises that enabled officers in the field to procure vital foreign intelligence.
We can match the best that anybody can do in terms of concealing somebody's true appearance. We go all the way from facial appearance to body appearance, the whole 9 yards. We can create an entirely new persona for an individual, and for everybody that's going overseas, we do just that.
Tony Mendez's wife, Jana Mendez, also served as the CIA's chief of disguise.
When you plan an operation, you know the kind of surveillance that you have in that country. In other words, you would call that your audience, and you're going to plan your operation and you're going to play it to your audience.
In order to deceive hostile surveillance, the CIA looked to the age-old skills that magicians use to deceive their audiences. Skills used with the utmost effectiveness by master illusionists Penn and Teller.
1. Palm. To hold an object in an apparently empty hand. If you put your hands in your pockets a lot when you're not doing anything sneaky, when you put your hands in your pockets when you do something sneaky, people are less apt to notice it.
There's a factor in magic and stage management called misdirection. Take the scene in Cool Hand Luke, for instance, where the road gang is out there on the road and suddenly they come upon this blonde washing her car. If you had something like that going on in the courtyard of your residence, all these people who are supposed to be watching you might be watching that. That's what you call misdirection. And you could, haul an elephant through the courtyard probably when that's going on.
Maybe there was a person in Site A and the person needed to be gotten to Site B. And maybe the place was being watched. How can you move a person? Well, when you start thinking about things like that, you start thinking about magic.
Steal, ditch, misdirection. What misdirection really is the moving of the idea. It's not moving the eyes where you're looking, but rather getting people to follow and take for granted a whole course of action while you're doing slightly different. Is he really crushing out a cigarette? Is he really adjusting his hat? Is he really pulling out a fresh cigarette?
So an example of misdirection might be using a large motion like this, and to hide the small motion like this. And this is the way you palm a card. For instance, you got the cards in your hands, you got your hands going like this, and this small motion pushes the card in the back down in the deck, and this motion then picks it up.
Looks simple, doesn't it?
That would relate to putting a signal up while under surveillance. You might be moving your hand like this, and you got a little piece of lipstick on it that they don't see, and that actually lands on that parking meter or whatever as you go down, and they don't see that.
Our officers operating overseas are constantly being observed, being trailed, being surveilled to see if in fact they are doing anything that this foreign intelligence service would want to prevent. They have got to be able to operate under that very tight scrutiny almost flawlessly. The disguises, the alias, documentation, everything must be world class.
Undercover intelligence officers working in foreign lands must learn to improvise during times of crisis.
Maybe if you were a Westerner, looked like a Westerner, you might somehow be in jeopardy simply by virtue of your Western ethnicity. You could change yourself sort of a field expedient disguise by changing the tone of your skin and changing the profile of your clothing. And you can do that quickly enough by taking your jacket off, ripping the liner out of your jacket and wrapping it around your head like a turban. And then you could run your fingers around the inside of a tailpipe and take the black soot, apply it to your face to give your skin a more darkened tone. It's not a disguise that's going to stand up under close scrutiny, but the purpose of that would simply be to let you leave an area safely without having undue attention drawn to yourself.
As the dangers imposed by the Cold War escalated, the CIA required more effective protection for officers operating in hostile countries. They needed to improve their disguise capabilities. Tony Mendez was drawn to the techniques already being developed in Hollywood. After witnessing the amazing transformations from the 1968 feature Planet of the Apes, Tony realized the same techniques could be used to transform CIA officers.
This is award-winning makeup at the time. This was considered to be the state-of-the-art in 1969, 1970, and the makeup artist got the Academy Award for makeup. Only the second Academy Award ever presented for makeup at that point. This is 1970 Planet of the Apes makeup, and under this you will see the actual model of the actor's face. So that would be his contours, and then the makeup artist would create in just regular clay these features, which are then made into a mold. Where the ape appliances required 3 hours of makeup, something like this would be used by a stunt double for a distant shot. This is very crude if you look at it here, but in the motion picture, if it didn't look quite right, if there was a fold that looked unnatural, they would reshoot that particular sequence. We can't do that in the real world. We're working in a theater in the round, if you will, and we have no chance for retakes. It's got to be done right the first time.
And in that theater, Mendez became the master. For the first time, Tony demonstrates his master disguise techniques on historian Keith Melton. He begins by making a plaster cast of Melton's face. The process shown here took place in hotel rooms and hideouts all over the world during CIA covert rescue operations throughout the Cold War. Casts were made to create prosthetic devices which enabled Tony to convert Melton into a Russian peasant. The next step is the creation of a wig.
One of the classic identifiable characteristics we all have is the way we wear our hair. And if you're doing identification, you're always looking for a part of the person that can't be changed that readily, and that is the hairline. You can change the hairstyle, but you can't change the line. So we integrate the wig maker arts into this craft of disguise using ordinary plastic wrap and good old Scotch tape.
Because it was impossible to bring a master wig maker to hideouts around the world, this method enabled him to create a pattern which could be shipped back to the United States. The wig would then be crafted according to Tony's specifications.
What I'm doing now is I'm going to create a contoured head pattern and then draw on this pattern the new hairline. Okay, we've got a subject here who parts his hair where 85% of the males his age in this culture might part it. So what we're going to do is try to cover some of those identifying features. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a partless hairstyle, kind of a pompadour, hairstyle. Each one of these hairs between this line and this line will be put in individually by hand into the finest hair lace that we can get to make this a really high quality piece. But these marks show the wig maker how to construct the cap, how I want it constructed. So we have recorded the contours of his head. I'll fold this up and put it in an envelope and mail it off to my wig maker, which there are only a few master wig makers left in the world. So here's the handmade hairpiece. You can see that edge has all been ventilated in there by hand the way that we specified. And if they've been true to our pattern, this should fall right into place. And you don't want to do this work if you're afraid to stick your finger in somebody's ear. A little alcohol, a little spirit gum. So we're getting it positioned here. And then we're going to apply a little adhesive along the edge. And see with the comb of the teeth of the comb, you just go in and get it set. In the meantime, the Rasputin factor. All lace is made in Nottingham, England, but all coatings are not the same. And there's only a few good coaters in the world. A couple in Japan and one in Hollywood. And he's now passed. He was 80-something when I struck that deal with him. It was in his will that his daughter would continue to use the secret formula and give the CIA 3 pieces. See where the hair's coming out of there? It just disappears. And it was because he was a vain man and he didn't like the toupees that he was getting made in Hollywood, and he decided he was going to make a better one.
To complete the deception, Tony has altered the profile by crafting a false nose.
Okay, now I'm going to start adding a little bit of the age lines and wrinkles on his face to try to blend him into this character that we've created here. So I'm just taking an eyebrow pencil and I'm basically just drawing a whole new face for him. This is just pure subtle form of theatrical makeup.
Color is used to blend the prosthesis with the skin. The results must be seamless. An unattractive mole is added, and the disguise is nearly complete. The profile continues to be altered with the insertion of upper and lower false teeth.
And what that's going to do is give him a different line of this lip down here. Okay, so now the muscles in his mouth, they're going to start changing shape, and it's going to end up changing the outside contours of his face. He's actually going to have a different mouth line, which is one of those things that's hard to change. And then we're going to add the plumper and facade for the top, which is not only going to change the shape of his mouth, but it's also going to change the look of his teeth. It's going to give him another subjective detractor here, which is this gold tooth. And of course, you always want to have those glasses kind of fingerprinted. Obviously, this guy's not going to clean his glasses even at this point in his life.
It feels very different. One thing I notice immediately is that the dental appliances alter the way I speak. That's good in that it makes me feel that the disguise is complete and effective and would give me confidence if I was participating in an exfiltration and I needed, my life depended on the effectiveness of this disguise.
Throughout the years, Hollywood's disguise techniques continued to improve, as did the CIA's. This allowed officers to more easily infiltrate hostile countries. But once there, in order to operate successfully, they had to learn how to outwit the best surveillance teams in the world.
The essence of disguise and deception is managing the stage. The disguise would be just one portion of that plan.
Mendez knew that a disguise was not enough cover for officers in countries such as Russia.
Moscow is one of the most hostile cities in the world for foreign intelligence to operate. What the CIA did was develop a new way of action.
This new way was referred to as the Moscow Rules, a protocol of conduct for officers working against surveillance teams in hostile countries.
What you have to have is you have to have a very comfortable equilibrium established between you and your team.
There was always this understanding with your surveillance team that you were a pair. You knew it and they knew it. And there was always this kind of comfortable truce.
They may believe that they're with you every moment, but there are moments which we call I.O. or in obscura. In other words, you're actually in the shadows, if you will. For instance, if you pass behind the light post or you pass through a doorway and down a stairwell, there's going to be a wink of an eye up to maybe several minutes when you're actually out of sight. But surveillance is going to think they have you.
Field officers know that eluding surveillance requires patience.
If you keep taking them through configurations that are difficult for them to stay with you, you will whittle away your surveillance team.
You're going to be in the shadows, and that's when you can do your shadow chores, which means one of these acts like putting down a drop or even making a telephone call or mailing a letter or making a brush pass, which means brushing by the asset and exchanging something, or even having a personal meeting. Your gut is the final check on whether or not it's safe and whether or not you're going to kill the agent or not by doing that I.O. chore, putting down that brick in the brickyard. Because if they detect it, all they got to do is stake it out as long as it takes, and whoever arrives in a few hours or a few days to pick it up has got to be the asset, and they're dead.
All CIA troops heading to hostile countries were taught the Moscow Rules. These individuals were referred to as pipeliners. The pipeliners' training included rehearsals on the streets of Washington, D.C. Areas could be configured here to mirror the layout of any foreign city. In this simulation, Tony and Jana act as the surveillance targets, or rabbits. They, along with actual members of a CIA surveillance team, simulate some of the principles.
The rabbits have led the surveillance team into a particularly difficult area here. It offers so many avenues of escape. For instance, there's a stairwell across there, a bridge here, and roadway on both sides. They could go in any direction. The challenge for the team now is to deploy themselves and watch for these two to see what they're going to do.
They're set up around the block and along the canal at this point, and Jana will be getting up and I'll sort of follow her, but then I'll hang back. They won't know how to react with the two of us separating like that. It'll take them a minute to decide what to do. Okay, let's go. Jana's made her move, and the surveillance has got a problem.
I see Jana moving towards the stairwell over here. She may be using that as a channel. A channel is particularly difficult on the surveillance team because it draws them down into an area that does not have cover for their actions. She can determine that she has surveillance as they move down through that stairwell. And then the other question is, could she be performing an operational act down in there? We don't know, but we have to find out.
All the training the officers have received comes down to a last-second decision. Have they managed to elude surveillance? And is it safe to make the drop or leave the signal that could initiate a series of planned events?
There's always this dance at the end when you say, well, this looks like an I.O. It feels good. Where could they possibly be? But you know, there's always that hesitation. It's a very gutsy call. In the end, you're either clear to go or you're not. And if there's any doubt, you don't go. You abort the operation.
For many years, the Moscow rules set the foundation for several successful CIA operations. In time, they were compromised as one CIA pipeliner turned traitor delivered a near-fatal blow to United States security. Edward Lee Howard seemed as if he would make an extraordinarily good officer. He was trained at the CIA's top-secret facility known as the Farm and rose to the top of his class. He was selected for a first tour assignment in Moscow.
Everybody was really charmed by this guy who had a rotten core, until he started doing some rather strange things in the course of his day, such as, stealing other people's parking pass, taking money out of the coffee fund, really stupid little petty things that, pretty soon got noticed.
After failing a routine polygraph exam, Edward Howard was fired. He and his wife Mary moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. The CIA believed he had also tried to contact Soviet officials.
A series of incidents in Moscow had occurred beginning in the early summer of 1985 in which key CIA assets were being arrested and even liquidated in Moscow.
The CIA was alerted by a Soviet defector, KGB officer commander Vitaly Yurchenko, of a traitor supplying the names of intelligence officers operating in Moscow.
He only knew them by the codename Robert, had been a CIA officer who had once been selected to go to Moscow, but then had run into problems and didn't go. And it was this information that made the FBI zero in on Edward Lee Howard.
The FBI began to watch and listen to the Howard's every move, tapping his phone and secretly videotaping his house.
They were pretty sure at this point that he had gone with his wife on a trip to Vienna, Austria, and probably had at least one meeting with KGB, and probably had given secrets away already. But they were trying to gather evidence of espionage on him.
Ironically, when Yurchenko exposed Edward Lee Howard, the CIA sent Aldrich Ames to debrief him. Unbeknownst to the CIA, Ames himself was a traitor. Realizing this information would expose Howard, Ames sent an emergency message to Moscow. Days later, the KGB warned Howard he was in danger. Utilizing the techniques he learned from his CIA training, he began to plan his escape.
Is there a road, the right time of day, dusk, early evening, that he could get sufficiently far ahead of the surveillance team that they would allow a gap to occur to create a moment in obscure? Howard knows that once he had identified the moment in obscure, that the key thing would be to develop a way for the car to stop, and he would get out, but he had to put a dummy up so that from behind the surveillance team would see Mary driving and Howard seated in the passenger seat.
Howard began working on a dummy referred to by the agency as a jack-in-the-box, or jib.
Well, in the Howard case, I think we trained him too well.
So we went in the garage and took only household items that were laying around. He took a toilet plunger because the rubber base would sit flat on the seat, the vertical staff, the handle that went up. He taped a coat hanger with electrical or duct tape so it would form the shoulders, and he put just an old safari-style jacket he had around the house. So from the back, it would look as the shoulders of a man.
He had a wig that we'd given him when he was in basic training, and he had a styrofoam head block.
Howard finished the jib and hid it on the floor of the passenger side of his car. He then altered his brake lights so that surveillance wouldn't notice the car was slowing as he jumped out. After eating dinner, the Howards drove home on a route predetermined by Edward earlier that day.
way she went with this silhouette of him in there, which wasn't him. Of course, he's in the bush now. As the FBI said, he was in the wind. He was gone.
Mary continues to drive home. Suddenly, the FBI sees Mary and a figure they believe is Howard in the car returning home. So suddenly, though they didn't know he was gone, the loop was closed.
It worked. The technique worked as it should have.
Once inside, Mary took one more step to close the loop. She phoned the family doctor, knowing that she would reach an answering machine. She proceeded to play back a message pre-recorded by her husband.
Hello, Dr. Rogers. This is Ed Howard calling. I would like to make an appointment with you sometime next week, preferably on Thursday. Please give me a call back when you can to confirm. Thank you.
Surveillance was reassured that Edward was in the house. Mary knew he was gone for good.
And Howard was following our MO to a fare-thee-well, and he even added a few flourishes and curlicues to it of his own. It was very well done.
The jib and the pre-recorded message misdirected the FBI long enough to allow Howard to flee the country. Months later, he turned himself over to a Russian embassy in Europe. He betrayed countless agents and spies working in the Soviet Union, costing many lives and delivering a devastating blow to CIA operations.
The real downside to that, besides our agents being killed because of him, he gave away what we call our silver bullets. These were the techniques that we had developed for eluding surveillance in Moscow. And once they got onto it, of course, they could defend against it. So we had to create new techniques.
During the years following Edward Howard's escape, the CIA was faced with a series of operations that ended in disaster. They were forced to ask themselves if this was a result of information leaked by Howard, or were there other factors involved?
Was there some way, unknown to the CIA, that the KGB was able to track CIA officers and CIA assets? So they began to look at, were there ways that, called tagging, that the KGB was able to impart a substance onto a person, to their hand, their clothing, their shoes, in which they could use this substance unknown to the wearer, the target, and they could then say, had this person been in this room, had they gone to this building.
What we did is looked at all these different ways that you might tag somebody, because once we're free in that IO mode, we didn't want to be reacquired.
Every possible substance was studied, from infrared beams to the insect mating scents known as pheromones. The CIA contracted specialists in the field of entomology to determine the viability of pheromones as a method of tagging. Dr. Ring Cardet is an entomologist with UC Riverside.
If you tag the individual, you're going to put a given amount of compound someplace on this individual. This is a cage of quiet moths, and we're introducing into it a pheromone source that contains 100 billionths of a gram of a synthetic copy of the female's natural pheromone. What we have is a fairly immediate reaction in males. They begin by walking, by elevating their antennae, and especially by fanning their wings.
With the insect pheromone, for instance, the way they would interrogate that would be to deploy it at choke points, like this little kiosk tender with a box with an insect in it of some kind that was really interested in the mark that they'd put on you, and as you went passing by in this wonderful disguise, the insect would detect the pheromone and go crazy in this little box.
The CIA compiled lists of all the tagging scenarios that would work. Together with Tony Mendez, they also had to train new operational techniques to pipeliners headed overseas. Washington, D.C. became a test ground. Here, the pipeliners were pitted against CIA teams that could emulate the particular surveillance operations of any country.
This is their first chance to see if they could beat me. Everything we'd done up to this point was another kind of operational act, but it wasn't the use of disguise for an escape.
Mendez recalls a particular pipeliner test that involved many of the rules of deception. It was called the Hay-Adams escape. On the particular night in question, they knew that Mendez and a young female pipeliner would undertake a disguised escape. This night was also the eve of George Bush's inauguration.
They selected this because it's almost a carnival atmosphere in Washington. And because of that, there's so many people, it was normal to go to different restaurants and go to different lounges because this is what people were doing. And Tony also knew that on inaugural eve, that the tendency would be for people to be overdressed, wearing their evening attire. And surveillance teams would begin to think that is the common.
Mendez was on the sidewalk level in the bar of the Hay-Adams Hotel, which is situated across from the White House. He was dressed in formal attire, ready to go party hopping.
He was sitting there having a drink and waiting for this young girl. She could have been his daughter or his niece to come and meet him. And so she came in dressed very informally as a student.
After one drink, the young woman got up and went to the restroom.
This immediately causes a number of members of the team to begin to create a new pattern of surveillance to watch her as she goes down the passageway to the women's room. This has eroded some of the capability of the surveillance team. She goes inside. There are women coming and going. Inside in the stall, in her backpack, was a change of attire.
She quickly changed into evening dress herself, then took the stairs into the lobby area, where she easily merged into the crowd.
She walked through all of the surveillance, walked into the lounge, and up one of the inner exits into the main part of the hotel, walked immediately to the front, got into a cab, and successfully escaped. The rabbit got away.
At the point when Mendez estimated that the surveillance team might be starting to wonder where she was, he made his move.
And the team is still saying, well, he seems to be in place and she's still at the, they don't miss her. They're not concerned yet. But maybe one or two are starting to wonder. So when you get to that point in your mental clock when they might be getting worried and you think she might have made it away, then you get up.
He gets up, pays his bill, and confidently walks out the front door of the lounge onto the street. Now at this point, he has infused panic into the surveillance team. They have eroded. Partially, they're still watching the women's room because they saw her go in. Another group of them says, well, maybe she got out. So they're trying to reacquire her in the lounge and now expanding into the hotel. But they're looking for a young, casually dressed young woman. So there are fewer of them now to follow Tony.
If they want to parallel me, which is what they're trying to do, not be on the same street with me necessarily, but to get around and ahead of me because they have no idea where I'm going. They're having a lot of difficulty just because of the geometry of that stair-step run.
Meanwhile, having eluded surveillance, the young woman was able to successfully execute her operational chore. A dead drop, undetected, in another hotel. She then leaves a signal to inform her asset the drop has been made. In an I.O. moment, Mendez managed to slip into a grungy disguise.
And in my top coat, I have my disguise, which is a sweatsuit and kind of an old man disguise, tweed hat, beard, thick glasses, grungy sweatsuit, grungy tennies. And then I come out of that site looking quite different. Certainly not somebody that's going to go to an inauguration eve party, but maybe out to take the air and to get a newspaper at the corner, that sort of thing.
Mendez had also successfully eluded surveillance. Both he and the young woman were able to complete their missions, then reconvene at the hotel bar, dressed exactly as they had been at the start. The surveillance team had been completely fooled. During the Cold War years, the CIA's Office of Technical Service had many opportunities to hone their skills of disguise and deception, but perhaps nowhere more so than when it came to the extremely sensitive and dangerous game of exfiltration, rescue operations designed to bring defectors, refugees, or operatives to safety. One of the great exfiltrations of the Cold War was the case of Oleg Gordievsky.
Oleg Gordievsky was perhaps one of the most key defectors to leave the KGB and to begin to work for MI6, or the British. He was, at the time he defected, he had become the chief of station, or the residentura, at the Russian or Soviet embassy in London. He was the chief spy for the Soviet Union in the KGB in England.
In 1985, CIA officer turned traitor Aldrich Ames betrayed Gordievsky, informing the KGB he was a double agent working for the British. Gordievsky was immediately recalled to Moscow.
The MI6, the British Secret Service, and he probably had time to make a plan before he went back of how they would get him out of there. Always have a plan of rescue for an important asset.
Once in Moscow, Gordievsky was put under constant surveillance.
So they put him under a period of interrogation. MI6 had prepared Gordievsky with an escape plan, but only Gordievsky could initiate it. Oleg Gordievsky realized he must lull the KGB into a sense of false confidence, so he wanted to establish a pattern. Each day he would leave his apartment and jog to a nearby park.
Gordievsky followed this routine daily. Meanwhile, the KGB continued their interrogation.
They tried even at one time to drug him and put a special powder in his whiskey that made him hallucinate, hoping they would break.
Facing likely execution, he decided to put the predetermined escape plan into operation. Every morning, British secret intelligence officers would pass the same street corner. All Gordievsky had to do was show up on that corner, carrying a particular shopping bag.
He initiated the signal, but on a personal standpoint, what was most poignant to him was that the escape out of Moscow was for him alone. He would have to leave his wife and children.
Gordievsky had no choice. He knew the time for escape was now. There may not be another chance. As far as the KGB was concerned, it was just another routine day.
The KGB surveillance saw him leave the apartment, saw him begin his jog, saw him enter the park. But in the middle of the park, he turned and headed to an exit that they didn't guard. Calmly walked out of the park, proceeded to the nearest underground, the subway station, went immediately to the train station going to St. Petersburg.
After arriving in St. Petersburg, he took a bus to the countryside and waited at a designated area near the Finnish border.
It was the first and only time an individual has ever escaped Moscow under the exact nose of the KGB surveillance teams.
Meanwhile, phase 2 of the escape was put into effect. A pregnant female officer at the British Embassy in Moscow left for a routine medical checkup in Finland. As always, she was followed by KGB surveillance.
If they could speed up, increase the gap from the surveillance team in the car behind them, they could turn in the car park and not be seen, and the KGB would pass the park unnoticed.
The car eluded surveillance and rendezvoused with Gordievsky. He climbed into the trunk through the back seat and hid.
They covered him with an anti-surveillance blanket. We call him a thermal blanket that would prevent his heat signature from being noticed if the KGB was using a sophisticated form of thermal imaging.
With Gordievsky stowed away, the car headed off to the border crossing.
Theoretically, the car is covered under diplomatic immunity. But at the time, if the KGB border guards had realized Gordievsky was there, they would have certainly arrested him and pulled him out of the car.
Passport, yeah.
They went through the initial phase in which they demanded papers, but quickly they noticed there was another member of the KGB border guard with a trained dog that was there just to sniff out people hiding in the cars.
And this case officer, female MI6 officer, thought very quick to hand the dog part of her sandwich and distract the dog. So a little bit of misdirection against the dog using the sandwich.
Dobra, basba kamraty.
Gordievsky had been instructed to remain hidden until he heard a certain song. Once it was played, he came out of hiding. He was now a free man. Throughout the Cold War, Tony Mendez and the CIA conducted over 150 similar successful exfiltrations, all of them using disguise and deception. Tony and Jana have since retired.
When I stepped away from the agency, I didn't know it was quite over when I stepped away. It took, I think, a couple of years to put it in perspective and to see that that wall was going to stay down and that things really had sorted themselves out.
In 1997, Tony Mendez received one of only 50 Trailblazer Awards for being what the CIA considered as one of the foremost individuals responsible for the success of the United States throughout the Cold War.
No one does this sort of thing by themselves. It was a function of having the right people helping, and there are very many of them out there who are not getting any credit that should. But as a spokesman for them, I feel very proud.
You could pick up the Herald Tribune and read a headline and kind of smile and nod your head because you would know just a little bit more maybe than what the paper was printing. It was always fun to be a part of it.
Deception throughout the Cold War, used by both sides, was what the Cold War was all about. It was indeed a war that was conducted in the shadows with lies. And we just turned out to be better at lying than they did. And some say, that we were just better poker players.